screen. So that should be up now. Let me know if that's not working. Great. So I'm going to run through a lot of what we've learned in the past 6+ years or so working on climate readiness for affordable housing across a range of projects, from the large scale portfolio down to individual sites, some more regional and national in scope, and some really local and right in our backyard. A quick intro slide about New Ecology. I think most folks on the call know us, so I'll spare you this one, but I do want to give this image a little bit of time. This is an overview of where we've done a lot of our resilience work to date. And so what you see in some of these summaries, a lot of planning and regulatory owner and financing partners trying to understand the really pragmatic approaches to quantifying climate risk and planning climate readiness in both existing multifamily affordable stock and new construction across a real range of scales. So just to point out one project that's going to come up, probably will be referenced in shorthand, is the CHARM project, or Climate Hazard Adaptation and Resilience Master Plan project for the state of Massachusetts Department of Housing and Community Development. So that's obviously the dot right there in Boston, roughly 1,400 developments in that project. And we'll skip backwards there. And so if I say CHARM, that's what I'm talking about, kind of lessons learned from that large planning project. The brief agenda for the presentation right now is starting big picture. I'm going to go over some resources for climate projections so we can understand what's available and the tools you have at your disposal to start to understand the climate risk in your own portfolios. We'll talk a bit about building and population characteristics as really the missing component of climate planning when we think large scale about climate, but which you are all really best positioned to understand and to interpret. Prioritizing within your portfolio where to start doing the work. We'll talk a bit about tools for building and site assessments and lessons learned from building and site assessments to date, as well as the capital planning process and integrating resilience planning into capital planning. Some resources for building and site guidelines that you can follow, your designers, your facilities teams can follow. And also emergency preparedness planning, what we think of as the soft side of resilience, the non-infrastructure piece. So looking at climate projections, when we think about climate projections, this is what we're talking about, going from left to right. We're talking about projections for increasing rainfall, for increased sea level rise on a day-to-day basis, for increased storms, especially in this region, extreme hurricanes, and then extreme heat and heat waves. And this is future looking, but it's also today. So on the left, we have a graph showing the tide gauge in Boston Harbor over the past 100 years and the roughly 1 foot of sea level rise we've experienced in that time. And an image of a king tide flooding looking across from Fort Point and the former new GE office site in Boston, flooding in 2018. Climate risk is kind of on the horizon, but also here with us. And so one thing that's important to think about, we have a lot of opportunities to mitigate emissions related to climate change, and that's not really the focus of the presentation today. Most of what we're talking about today is baked into the emissions that have already occurred in the past. And so we're looking at projections for a future that is certainly coming, and that we can have some certainty and preparedness for. Some really good tools that are coming out on the national scale. Just this one is piqued a lot of curiosity lately. This is an image from Flood Factor, flooding risk mapped not just from FEMA flood mapping, but also from additional sources that are forward-looking as opposed to backward-looking that the FEMA mapping is. And if you go on, for instance, realtor.com right now and you look at a property, flood factor scores are now being reported along with real estate listings. So this is a new development. You can zoom in on sites. This just happens to be a snapshot of that tool for Boston. But the awareness in the kind of popular culture is certainly there. This is an interesting tool coming out of the University of Maryland and their Center for Environmental Science, their climate scientists. This is a tool that looks to put a given location in its future climate zone about 60 years into the future. And so this is really useful for us to understand not just that the climate is warming and that will mean increasing temperatures, certainly daytime temperatures and highs, but also nighttime temperatures. There's a humidity component to that. And there's a whole range of experiences that are embedded in a statement like Boston will be Baltimore, right? We understand that a lot more intuitively than just looking at kind of increasing temperature numbers. And so the idea behind this tool is to get a sense the thick red line indicated is the most likely scenario, but then the thinner black lines are the outside cases for other climates that we might find ourselves in. And you can put in whatever location you're happen to look at. This one again for Boston. But that's big picture national stuff. We've got incredible tools here in the state of Massachusetts, really state of the science tools for climate planning. So Resilient MA, which is the statewide clearinghouse for research around climate projections, has a mapping tool that maps sea level rise and coastal flooding, heating degree days, and extreme precipitation. The tool as it stands right now, it's updated regularly as new data come in. The coastal flooding is a combination of different tools, including the Boston Harbor Flood Risk Model and the NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration's storm flooding maps. The Massachusetts Coast Flood Risk Model was just completed this winter. That is really the most finely grained coastal flooding model anywhere. And those data will be integrated into this mapping tool, but probably not for about another year. They're going through an extensive QA/QC process before that gets rolled out. So once we know a little bit about what to expect at a given site, and we start to use these mapping tools to identify our climate hazards, we have to think about the other side of the picture, because a building that is susceptible, or a population that's susceptible to risk, is far higher priority than a building that can withstand risk. And so we need to understand the buildings themselves. And that's something that is missing from a lot of the big picture climate research, but that we certainly can take a good look at. So this is not a surprising graphic. This is a graphic showing our housing unit demographics by the major metropolitan areas, the top 10 in the country. Boston has the oldest building stock in the country, no shocker. We have the largest proportion of the oldest buildings. So old buildings, new climate, what does that mean? Primarily that means that we don't have air conditioning. And we have a higher proportion of buildings without air conditioning than anywhere else. And so even though, yes, we are a cooler climate than Miami, certainly, we are far less prepared for extreme heat than climates that really grew, than cities that grew in climates that are warm. Because all the major kind of urban development that we see, like in the Sun Belt and the densification of cities in that region, happened as a result of air conditioning going into buildings. We have a city that developed pre-air conditioning, and so we're really just not ready for that extreme heat. It's also important to think about building characteristics, certainly around extreme heat, in addition to the exterior temperatures and temperatures as impacted by urban heat islands. Buildings act a little bit differently than the outdoors. They can concentrate heat, they can collect it and store it. So this is a graph of 1 month of the temperature in a top floor of a triple-decker unit, showing that consistently the indoor heat index exceeds the outdoor temperature. And so in this particular unit, that indoor heat index was in the extreme caution or danger zone for more than half of the month, as a result of the building responding to the climate in a way that really concentrated heat. So how do you focus within the portfolio that you're operating? Where do you start? there's a, usually start these presentations by going over there's some big picture scary stuff, but then there's also a lot of opportunity. And so we've done a lot of work thinking about how to focus efforts, because we certainly can't start everywhere all at once. We have to start at the places that are most at risk, and the populations that are most at risk within our portfolios. So for this example, I'm going to turn to some of the outcomes from the CHARM project that we did with DHCD. So the DHCD state-funded public housing portfolio in Mass, it's about 1,400 developments, 45,000 apartments, something around 80,000 residents. We did a comprehensive portfolio-wide risk and vulnerability analysis to allow DHCD to really prioritize where to spend their very limited capital dollars first. We ground truth that with some pilot site assessments that I'll talk about, actually with some LISC funded examples. And then we also produced a set of resilient design guidelines and tools that are soon, hopefully this month, to be publicly available, and which may be of value. So again, looking back out to the portfolio, one of the first steps we did was just map the probability of occurrence of climate risk factors. So from left to right, we looked at increasing precipitation. This is from state data. So sites that are more exposed to higher rainfall events, looking in the 2050 to 2070 time range. We looked at sea level rise and storm surge. We updated this recently, actually, with the new Mass Coast flood risk model. We were given access to those data prior to their public release, so able to really zero in on unexpected storm surge and sea level rise flooding events. And then we also looked at extreme heat through the lens of heating and cooling degree days. So this map I find really interesting. All the red dots, all the high risk for extreme heat are on the right side of the state, the eastern part of the state at lower elevations. Massachusetts right now is categorized as one climate zone under the Department of Energy climate zone categorizations. In the 15 to 20 year time frame, we're looking at a state which will be categorized in two climate zones. So we're going to have a cooler part of the state in the west and a warmer part of the state in the east. And so the timing of that switch is one of the big indicators we used for risk, so that the buildings that find themselves in a new climate zone sooner become higher priority. So in addition to looking at the climate risk, we also looked at the capacity to adapt and the vulnerability of the sites. So this is things like older population, the existence of in-place emergency preparedness plans, backup systems and what they serve, and sites that were better prepared were able to lower their relative risk ranking. Sites that are worse prepared and more exposed are obviously the ones that are least ready and should be addressed first. And so we rank the entire portfolio along these axes of risk and vulnerability. As we found with the CHARM project, we found in just about everywhere else we've looked at it, the portfolios this way. Of a large portfolio, 1,400 some odd developments, about 180 are really both high risk and poorly prepared. And so there's a subset, a small set, not nothing, but a small set of larger portfolios that tend to be the top priority. And that's one of the things we're really helping DHCD understand is where those buildings are, where those developments are. And like I said, we see this over and over again, that they're, across the whole portfolio, whether it's your portfolio or a cohort within a large region, there are some buildings we need to concentrate on. The vast majority are in much better shape. So once we've identified those sites that are highest priority for intervention, the next question is really, how do we understand what to do? This is part technical exercise, it's part planning and coordination. We're looking at building characteristics, population characteristics, funding and financing characteristics, insurance. It really does span a broad range of characteristics that we're doing these assessments across. This protocol and the effort that I'm going to present in a minute here comes out of kind of multiple iterations of understanding how to do these assessments in buildings, building out the tools, building out the process, testing them and revamping them over time. And the first example I'm going to share was funded by LISC here in Boston. This is a site that is called Waterview Apartments. It's one of the typical typologies that we see in the affordable housing, portfolio in the state. And so for many of you, this will look familiar. So built in the 1970s, mod rehab in the early 2000s, about 5 years ago. It's a roughly 40,000 square foot building, about 49 apartments, 1 and 2 beds, 3 stories. No basement. So this is something you're all used to seeing. It's located right on Old Harbor in Dorchester Bay, not far from the Old Colony Public Housing redevelopment site to the west. And this is a map looking using the Climate Ready Boston Map Explorer. So this is something the city of Boston has pulled together for planning purposes. It integrates extreme heat, potential storm water flooding events, as well as coastal flood risk. You can look at FEMA flood maps, but again, those are backward looking. So this is looking at forward looking at future flooding risk. And this tells us that our site, shown here in the middle of the image, is kind of proximal to the coast. It's at a similar elevation as sea level, not too high above it. It's not in the flood map on this Climate Ready Boston Map Explorer, but it's near it. And this is a really important point. Predicting flooding is really tough, especially coastal flooding. So for example, FEMA maps for New York City during Superstorm Sandy got it about half right. About half of the sites that were expected to flood did, and the rest of the sites that flooded were expected not to flood. So this is where there's a lot of technical information, but there's also some judgment to be made about how close you want to be to risk, and really doing that site walkthrough to understand if we're out of the flood zone because we're up on a cliff right next to the flood zone, or if we're out of the flood zone because we're at a very shallow grade from the water. So kind of cross-referencing other tools is a good idea. This is a map showing the same site. The building is the L shape in white there. This is the NOAA slosh map. So this is not looking at future sea level rise, but it is looking at hurricane storm surge. And so if we get a big storm, even not that big a storm, actually, our site then is in the floodwater. And so interpolating between these two tools, we have a good sense that flooding is a risk at this site. Importantly, this is not in the FEMA 1% flood zone. So when a new mortgage is established for the property, it is not required to purchase flood insurance. There is no flood insurance requirement here. So we looked at, kind of taking all of the things we learned from the building walkthrough, which I should say also included an energy efficiency component assessment that we won't dig into too much. But from the walkthrough, we also did an interview with the folks who manage the site, the property manager, and their historical understanding of the site. And we created a list of recommended resilience actions. And the way that we create these is to strategically list them out by kind of lowest cost, greatest benefit, and the capital planning timing for the project. Because it doesn't make a lot of sense to recommend a high dollar value improvement that might provide marginal benefit, especially if it's out of context with the capital planning time horizon of the site. So this is the list for Waterview. The first thing you see on the list there really is what I referred to earlier as the soft side of resilience, emergency preparedness planning. Just knowing who on your site is handling what during an emergency, how residents are informed, their understanding of the emergency response. That I'll talk about in a little bit more detail down the line. After that, we recommended flood insurance. So This doesn't happen often with the sites that we've been at, but if you have a site that you have some, you're fairly confident will flood, and you're not in the FEMA flood zone, flood insurance is really cheap and a really smart low-cost investment to protect yourself, at least provide some financial protection in the event that you are flooded. We also recommended backup potable water. So certainly in Boston and in Eastern Mass and municipalities served by MWRA, it's been a little bit tough communicating the backup potable water recommendation. We're used to clean and safe drinking water coming out of the tap 24/7, 365 days a year. But it's interesting. We reviewed these results with the owner at this site shortly after the recent events in Texas and the power grid failures that led to potentially contaminated drinking water. And that really actually helped us bring our message home. Similarly, in this region, if the power grid goes down and water treatment goes down, if kind of drinking water handling sites are contaminated by flooding, potentially, potable drinking water may not be expected. And this is a pretty low cost investment to do some backup. This is thinking about backing up with just stored water on site, bottled water, whether it's temporarily stored like in inflatable containers or drinking water jugs. We also talked about creating a resilience hub. So we expect that the whole building can't be backed up in the event of an emergency, but part of the building can be. So this would be creating kind of a flood-safe cooling shelter in the community room on site. We looked at backwater valves just to mitigate against stormwater backing up into the building. We looked at sump pumps specifically for protecting mechanical equipment that's located at the first floor. In a kind of much higher expense category, we also looked at site floodproofing. There's some opportunity with grade here at this site to do a little bit of permanent and temporary flood fencing that in the event of a flood could be deployed and protect the site to some level, but at pretty high cost and not necessarily in line with the current capital plan timing. We also looked at window shading for mitigating extreme heat. And we looked at solar PV and backup battery. The last recommendation is kind of a TBD. Long-term would be recladding the building to provide some thermal benefit, certainly energy and operating savings, as well as some extreme heat mitigation. So for each of the sites that we've reviewed under this LISC program, we're also doing a solar PV feasibility analysis. So this is not a great site for solar. It's a good location, it's good orientation, it's a good flat roof, but it's also covered in like vents and piping penetrations and mechanical equipment. But even still, there's some opportunity for a good sized solar system at a pretty low cost in terms of return on investment. We look at direct ownership options, but certainly there are lots of other options to consider around power purchase agreements or community shared solar or other kind of funding and financing tools. I want to shift to another site that is a good case study on the other side of town in the West End. This is looking at solar and battery backup storage. So this is a site that despite being a taller building, the roof is fairly open. It's actually a much better candidate for a solar PV system fundamentally. But it's all one bedrooms. There's no backup. There is a backup generator for the elevator and some lights, but that's it. And so there's a community room here. And the scenario we're really thinking about is that in an extreme heat event, when cooling goes down and the generator can't keep the cooling going for the whole building, how do you create a cooling shelter? It would be very difficult to back up the entire building at this scale, but you could create a resilience hub within the building. And so we looked at the option for solar plus storage. What size solar system could we build and what size battery storage could we pair it with, looking at both kind of the financial reality of doing that as well as the technical feasibility. And so this is a graph showing the really important part of this graph is the dashed line. And that shows the battery state of charge. So how much kind of potential energy is stored in the battery over time during our scenario outage. So during a peak cooling season, midsummer outage, can we create a cooling shelter to get people a place to cool off, especially overnight? And what we found is that with a cost-effective solar plus storage system, we can actually back up that cooling shelter. Again, we can't back up the whole building, but we could provide a supplement to the on-site generator to do cooling in a room in a large room, actually the community room within the development. So this is the type of exercise that we're doing, kind of rounding out the whole picture of emergency planning, financial and insurance planning, infrastructure planning, and backup power and resilience hubs on sites. So I mentioned, or I alluded to a couple of times, when to do this work. So this is a guidebook that we created in partnership with Enterprise and the National Housing Trust for our project, similar to the CHARM project, but in DC, in Washington, DC. This is a redevelopment timeline and a guidepost for when within a redevelopment, it's best to plan and implement resilience opportunities so that they are lowest cost and least headache for the site. So this is something, publicly posted. Certainly we can share the link around. But the idea is really that early in due diligence, during early scoping and planning, understanding your risk, understanding what's possible at a site allows you to integrate that into your design and your budget and your capital plan. And then you get through the rest of your kind of planning process over 1, 2, or more years, and then you get to implement. And it's a good, one of the things we recommend is, it's a good idea to do that planning for resilience as soon as possible so you can get it into your budget and your scope, and then truing it up at the end when you actually go to implement the scope. So a tool I wanted to share, shifting gears a little bit, is the rapid risk and vulnerability assessment tool that we built. We built a couple of times, a couple of versions of this, but I'm going to share the one that we built for DHCD and that they're using in their capital needs assessments. This, again, the guidelines of this tool will be posted on DHCD's website for use by their local housing authorities. But it's really, the idea is to create a simple tool that a property manager, someone familiar with the site, could go through and get a first cut understanding kind of that ground truth beyond the kind of the mapped or big global picture understanding of how climate is going to impact a site. So the tool is structured as 34 yes or no questions. We think it takes about 20 to 30 minutes to do. It creates a 0 to 100 resilience score, so that if you're doing this over multiple sites, you can at least get some feel of how sites compare to one another. And it was designed for multiple uses and multiple users. So it shouldn't require a great deal of technical understanding, but like I said, it's a first cut, and beyond which kind of your technical folks, the folks who are doing your capital planning, your architects and engineers, can really take it and get a sense of where they may go with a project. This is what it looks like. It's a fairly neat and clean design. The output, oops, I can get the screen to advance. The output is a list of potentially applicable resilience strategies for a given site. And so this may include duplicative strategies. So if, say, stormwater flooding is a risk for your site, you might get multiple flooding mitigation measures recommended. And then the next step is to kind of evaluate those against one another and decide what's the best case for your site. So the output is a list of recommended resilience strategies for the site, but it's also a reference to a design specification guideline. So I want to talk a little bit about what those are. So the Department of Housing and Community Development for the state has a construction specification index set of guidelines for all projects, all capital projects that are done by architecture and engineering firms on behalf of local housing authorities. It's a really good reference document in and of itself, and it also includes a lot of energy efficiency and sustainability guidance. So rather than create a separate set of design guidelines around resilience for the state, we integrated our recommendations into their existing design documents. We revised about 30 of their design guidance sections with this new resilience information, so that when you're doing a boiler, you see a recommendation about whether or not it's in a flood zone and it needs to be elevated. When you're doing paving, you see a recommendation about whether you might consider permeable paving to help mitigate stormwater, for example. We also created a document that's kind of a key, a best practices list, and a reference back to those more technical design guidance sections. So this is kind of a mid-level in terms of technical understanding reference document between kind of cross-referencing the climate hazards with the recommended guidance. And then we also created some very user-friendly graphical documentation for the two most common building typologies in the DHCD portfolio. So low-rise and high-rise, essentially. And these are meant to be really the first pass introduction to possible site and building interventions. That, again, this is all will be publicly posted on DHCD's site. And the last set of guidance documents I want to talk about, again, this is coming out of multiple iterations of understanding what the right level of pragmatic planning is for emergency preparedness. We've done a lot of this work with enterprise community partners, understanding and adapting their tools, creating our own, and kind of figuring out what works for organizations that vary in size and complexity really dramatically. And what we produced is a set of guidance templates for creating emergency preparedness plans, as well as some recommendations for how those should be updated on an annual basis and how they can be tested through kind of scenario planning tabletop events within an organization. And so the idea that we boiled this down to is essentially identification of staff who have an emergency preparedness function, locating in a safe place and organizing critical information. So one of the things we learned during Hurricane Sandy, for instance, is that not everyone knows how to access the appropriate spending channels to do procurement during an emergency. So someone needs to be on call to manage that in case someone needs to go out and buy a generator on short notice, for example. And then we developed protocols that can really be filled in and used so that the folks aren't starting from square one. And those protocols are for building and systems, residents and apartments, evacuation and sheltering. The fine line here is always that housing operators are not first responders. So there is that function needs to be called in and sometimes, but there's kind of this in-between phase when a first responder maybe needs to be contacted, or a first response organization needs to be contacted, or an emergency doesn't quite rise to the level of first response. There's a role that the housing provider plays around evacuation and sheltering. And so we provide guidance in terms of what that looks like. And these, again, will be all posted. We can also share some links to other resources. Lots of organizations are starting to create templates and tools for what emergency preparedness plans look like. So I think I'm about 5 minutes over time there. That was my last slide. But I will pause and see if there are questions in the chat, or if folks have discussion.
Thanks, Tom. So I'm going to jump in here too and sort of help facilitate conversations. So first and foremost, if folks have questions or clarifications they'd like on the presentation, it'd be great to start with that. And then, we're hoping to facilitate just a discussion here and a conversation and start to get some of your all feedback around how you're thinking about this, how you want to be thinking about this, what resources you need, what strategies you think are going to be most appropriate. Just really start to share information around this topic.
I would say, I think it's terrific, Tom. I mean, we're in East Boston, we're in the floodplain. We built a building in 0304. Utilities are in the basement. They cost far too much to put them on top right now. We'd use up all our reserves. Built a new building down the streets, 4 feet above the floodplain. We're solar ready, but had to value engineer out the photovoltaic, that kind of thing. So I really think it's a very good and comprehensive analysis. And I think people underestimate the extreme heat thing we're coming up against, which is really the killer for seniors and young kids. And I do think I'm a little bit worried about unfunded mandates coming from the city and the state with, net zero energy and those kind of things coming out, score better, but you can't really fund it yet. So I think we have to keep pushing for those kind of things. But I think it's a really good analysis. So I thank you for doing that.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Phil. And just to respond on that, I think your point is really well taken, and something we've learned along the way, that there are different interventions that are appropriate for different sites relative to their capital plans, their funding available, where they are in their timeline, right? And like you said, moving the utilities to the roof or moving mechanical equipment to the roof in an existing building can be far more costly. And so we do also include in our recommended strategies opportunities to provide some level of protection in place, whether that's building a short wall around equipment that could be flooded, how to pair that with sump pumps, that kind of thing. I think an important piece in all of this too is the kind of the placeholder understanding. So for those sites that you have some risk and you may not have the capital dollars to mitigate the risk, you can kind of put the placeholder in the capital needs assessment in the plan, so that even if it's 10, 15, 20 years down the line, when you spend that next big infusion of funding in a rehab, let's say, you're ready to do it in a way that's kind of climate smart. So that's, there's some really good guidance actually coming out of New York City about how to integrate that into capital planning, so that we can kind of pair up our current understanding of climate risk with our long-term capital needs. The extreme heat example is also really important, and I think, this is one where we're not going to be able to mitigate and address this all on our own with individual sites. And so one of the things that came out of the DC project was that because we were doing it for the district government, they saw that not every site could be protected for extreme heat. And so what they did was they took a really critical look at their cooling shelter locations when they're operating, how close they are to affordable housing sites. And so in coordination with affordable housing owners to understand where those vulnerable populations are, and the expenditure of district funds to provide cooling shelters, they could do a better job of mapping them. They learned that a lot of cooling shelters don't really serve the folks that might need them. And so they could move those locations, they could think about different locations, and they also revamped their communications around cooling shelters so that more folks who needed access to them could readily understand where they could go.
And Tom, I think that's a really important point, just in the relationship that needs to be had between you all and your housing portfolios and what's happening at the community level, right? And that's true in the example that you just mentioned around heat, but that's also true for things like flooding. There are certain communities that are taking really proactive approaches to understanding the flooding risk and trying to implement community scale mitigation measures. And so understanding, it's not always easy to have full transparency about exactly what's happening and when on the community scale. That may influence the way that you think about a particular project, but being aware and knowledgeable about those planning efforts and implementation efforts, and understanding if they might influence the way you think about decision making and implementing strategies on your site is also a really important component. So Phil, it sounds like your team is really up to speed on these resiliency issues, and you're implementing it on your new construction projects. Like, you're really evaluating it and implementing these strategies on new constructions. And really the challenge has been more on the existing building side, and figuring out how to approach that.
Yeah, I think new construction is fairly easy. How to get it funded is another question. But then when you've got to rehab older buildings, and we've got lots of 3-deckers, and most of the city is 3-deckers or multifamilies, 80,000 buildings or more, that's where we're really going to be affected. So we are trying to, I think Scott Shaw may be on here for no, or maybe he had to leave, but we're trying to refinance all of our local properties, 50 or 60 buildings, and try to get them funded and brought up to speed on the resilience side. Yet where's the money coming from here? We want to do these things now. How do you do a white roof? How do you move the utilities? How do you upgrade them? How do you do, utility improvements, or all the things that we want to do now, but there's not enough money. So I think we all have to work with our friends in the city, and I'm not blaming the city when I talk about these things with the state. I think we're all sort of moving in the right direction, some faster than others, but we're not moving fast enough. So the financing tools and the other investments have to come forward faster. So those of us who want to do these now are in the floodplains, or we have a high heat index, which we do in East Boston, then we have to do this now, because we can't wait 10 years. We'll be underwater by then.
Tom, I think we've got an example from some of the work we did where we were able to really successfully integrate resiliency measures into the capital planning process for an existing property. I think it was in DC, right?
Yeah, in Southeast DC, and that's a site. It's up on a hill, but it experiences a lot of stormwater flooding as a result of upstream and the design of the stormwater infrastructure there, and has a lot of extreme heat exposure. So that was an interesting one where National Housing Trust had just acquired it in the last year, and that we were starting to do the work, and they were starting to create their redevelopment plan as they put some capital into the project after purchasing it from the previous owner. And they found their baseline is enterprise green communities as a kind of a green building guidepost. And what they found is that meeting that baseline captured about half of the recommended resilience measures that came out of our planning study. And I think that that still, like to your point, Phil, that still potentially leaves a gap in terms of what can be funded for those resilience measures, but it provided them the understanding of really in round numbers what that dollar value was, and so that they could quantify that when they went back to funders and the district, and that's I think an important step. It's not all the way there yet, but I think a really important step to figuring out what we can knock off with kind of existing plan funding, and then quantifying for the funding and financing entities where our gaps are.
Just want to jump in. It looks like, did Laura Baker, did you have a question? Go ahead. Yeah.
I did. It's a little off topic. It's more about in the new construction and development end of things. We're starting to see requirements from municipalities for no fossil fuels in developments. And so you end up with an all electric building, which is great, except when the power goes down. And so we're looking a lot at the battery backup, and just wondered what you think the future of that will look like. Because right now it seems like it's very expensive, it takes a lot of space, and you don't get a lot of juice from it. So we have a project now where we're just building an extra storage for future batteries, assuming they're going to get better and they're going to get smaller and they're going to get cheaper. And I don't know what you think, is that the wave of the future in terms of all electric buildings where you want to have some kind of backup?
I think it is, and I think this is a really big topic, and there's been some excellent studies. Some of them focus specifically on Eastern Massachusetts and affordable housing, battery, solar plus storage feasibility assessments by the Clean Energy Group. So we can share those links around. Because this stuff is moving incredibly quickly. It's hard to kind of keep all the players and all the technical components. And there are certainly some other folks on the line today who have direct experience looking at this in their portfolio as well. I think a couple of big picture where this stuff is going, I do think we're moving to solar plus storage. I think that the driver for the big picture, for the utilities, is not the backup component. I think that's really the benefit that comes to you and your sites. I think that one of the big drivers is really evening out the grid and understanding how to incorporate renewables into the grid in a way that's predictable. So that is largely what's behind a new program in Massachusetts called Connected Solutions, which provides some funding from the funneled through the utilities to support batteries that can also, with some element of control and interface with the utilities, respond not just at your building, but kind of more broadly. I think, another big picture thing that we've seen is just looking at where folks are estimating the costs of batteries over the past 2 years in this region. That's fallen 50%. So it's not nothing. It's certainly not nothing. But like I said, that's just one of the indicators I'm seeing that this is moving very rapidly. The other big picture takeaway I have, and Lauren may have some others to jump in, is that we really see the solar providers, the existing infrastructure of the solar providers, as picking up this technical understanding, learning how to fund and finance it in the context of solar PV development. Because certainly from a system design perspective, but then also from a funding and financing perspective, when we're talking about tax credits and how do you access those if you're a nonprofit, how do you access the rebates and pair it all together, this really nicely fits with the folks that already know how to do solar and are doing that. And then also from a size perspective, it's interesting that batteries are different. We size generators, for example, to pretty specific emergency loads like elevators or lighting. But we get some benefit of a battery at just about any scale. The question is how much benefit? What can we back up? Can we just do some cell phone charging, or could we back up a whole room? Could we back up a whole system? And so that opens up the window to a lot of different capacities, and raises the question of how we design electric circuitry to accommodate that. What do we put on the critical loads circuit, and how do we plan for future batteries? So those are some of my big picture takeaways. I also see an interesting comment from Joe in the chat about building charging stations for electric cars that have the ability to provide some backup. This is something that I think is super interesting. A lot of car manufacturers, a lot of charging station manufacturers are building in the capacity for the chargers to go both ways. So this is what's called vehicle to grid. But essentially, because of the rebate infrastructure driving the advancement of the electric vehicle market, one of the cheapest ways to get batteries right now is to buy it in a car. And some of the biggest batteries that are on the market are also in cars. So if you can pair a vehicle or multiple vehicles with your building circuitry and vehicle to grid chargers, and you can plan that so that the vehicles are there and charged when you also need them. None of those are minor things to figure out, but there is the potential to provide some backup from those vehicle systems. And I think this is something that, there's an industry sprouting up around electric vehicle charger management, because we don't need one charger for every electric vehicle. We probably need something on the order of one charger for every 3 or 4 or 5 electric vehicles. And so there are companies that are sprouting up around managing, kind of navigating, moving the cars around literally and doing the charging, who will also probably be really nice fits for managing that as a storage capacity.
Other questions or examples of folks who have started to engage in resiliency planning or implementation on their existing properties?
Tom, I'm curious. I was really struck by when you were talking about the difference in the heat future problems between West and East Massachusetts. I'm curious if there are other stark differences around different parts of the state and how that affects potential strategy at the state policy-wide level and funding strategies and that kind of thing. Like, is that something that people are aware about, or is that like a more recent finding? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think not an unexpected finding that kind of fits in that category, but one that was good to resolve was the sea level rise storm surge risk. Certainly we have a ton of coastline in the state, but we also have a lot of topography. And so the Mass Coast flood risk model and the earlier Boston Harbor flood risk model were really nice for pinpointing where our greatest risk is. And the state is really starting to focus in on how to fund and incentivize improvements in that sea level rise storm surge risk band. Where we have a lot of uncertainty still is in a couple of areas, things that are both kind of categorically harder to predict, like extreme wind, and how we plan for that. That's a big unknown that's largely handled in the structural code, largely for new construction, but for existing buildings is a challenge. And it's not, unlike the coast, we can't say that, we can't say with nearly as much certainty where wind will be. The other hazard that fits into that category is extreme precipitation. We know that a warmer climate holds more water in the air, and that water falls out. And that's about the long and the short of it. And we know where water currently goes, but predicting how high it is, when it happens where, is something that we really struggle with. It's something that we've seen in a couple of recent events in Maryland, where places that kind of communities that had small rivers or streams running through them, many miles away, there was a large rain event, and then whole downtowns were washed out. And that kind of getting some predictability in planning for that is going to be a challenge because we have further to go. For instance, much of the western half of the state has never been mapped for that risk by FEMA. We know there are rivers out there, we know they flood, but there's a lot of catch up to do.
Yeah, I was just going to share too, Tom and Lauren, we did like a preliminary, I guess, as like a first step to help narrow our lens on some of the risks in our portfolio. We just did a sort of a simplified generator survey, and also highlighted like different types of outage events and weather events that our sites submitted back to us, and then we applied like a risk factor based on that and understood like where we had generators and where we don't. And it was pretty eye-opening just on a basic level. And we're sort of expanding that. And, I look at all these tools and resources that you've presented, and it's unbelievable what we have available in Massachusetts. And I'm like thinking about like Florida, and, have to dig in and see what they have down there, where we have a lot of coastal properties as well. So I don't know, I just wanted to throw that out there as sort of like one way that we initially sort of took the resilience emphasis and applied it to our portfolio to understand, but we certainly have a lot more to do. And I think the high heat issue, applies everywhere, not just, taking my takeaway from like the Massachusetts risks and vulnerability, it's like coastal flooding, a lot of flooding risk, and obviously, older building stock. But yeah, it's good to leverage this stuff in the design process as we are refinancing and getting new tax credits and things like that. So thanks for presenting on this.
Yeah, thanks for those comments, Nate. And I certainly, this is a conversation I've had with Julie a lot at your organization, and I think that's exactly the approach, is just kind of turning inward and looking at what you already know about your sites, and then what outside information you can bring to apply to them is really practical. New tools around this stuff are popping up all the time. So certainly in Florida, the city of Miami is really pushing, and some new tools in partnership with Enterprise are coming out soon. But also for other folks who are looking more broadly, or even just for background information, the National Climate Assessment, which is organized by something like 14 federal agencies every 4 years, is really quite good, and it's supported by some of the best climate science out there. So we can share that link around as well. But if you're looking at a region that's unfamiliar to you, or you're just looking for background about big picture, what we can expect in the future and how certain we are about it, that report is phenomenal.
I think one other thing this conversation brings to mind is just the sort of level at which these assessments are run. And, obviously within all of your organizations, you're starting to think about these issues and how you address it in your portfolio. We've also seen a lot of success in terms of doing these types of portfolio level analysis at the Housing Finance Agency level. So for example, we've been working in Delaware with the Delaware State Housing Finance Agency to evaluate their portfolio of projects. And so that sort of aggregates a lot of properties under a variety of different owners, and helps us really pinpoint the ones that are at highest risk. And we've seen the housing finance agencies be really interested in that information and starting to understand where they need to work with specific owners on particular properties to really improve resilience. And it gives you sort of the heads up as you're moving towards refinancing events on certain properties to be able to prioritize these issues.
I just wanted to say a couple things too. I know, like everyone else, it's a lot easier in new construction to incorporate resiliency measures. And I think one of the things that we're looking at in our portfolio is really getting the property manager to really focus on emergency preparedness and really try to have a document that they review often, and then understand who to call, but also how to prepare the residents. And I know when we had some really hot days last summer, the summer before, and the city had all these cooling centers, you know, we were letting residents know that, you know, if they go outside and they have to do errands or something, you know, here's a cooling center that you can go to. So I think just getting residents really prepared, I think is really important. We're also trying to work with the city on some of our, you know, renovations. Every time we do a turnover or a renovation, or, you know, work with the lean program to get some boiler funds or air sealing. And, you know, I think that also helps with resiliency, tapping into those resources through the lean program. And but with the city, not every inspector is really supportive of locating mechanical equipment above, you know, other than in the basement. And, you know, if the service comes in that location, that's where you have to locate the equipment. So we've tried to at least have wall mounted equipment or raise it to a higher level if we're really getting some difficult inspectors, and we try to work with them through other departments of the city. But I think it has to, you know, some of the municipalities are supportive, but we have to get folks sort of out of the silos and, you know, speaking with each other, like one city department talking to the climate envision people versus inspectional services. And so I think that has to, that really has to move forward for us to really try to get the existing buildings more resilient. And I don't know if other people have had issues in other cities or towns, but you know, Cambridge is pretty supportive, but at the same time, not 100% up to speed on all code stuff and issues with resiliency and on the inspectional side.
Yeah, thank you, Jane. And I realize we're at the hour, and there's so much good stuff there. And I think what you and Phil brought up is just really important about having all the standards and regulations and funding then be consistent. So I think it's a really good takeaway for us to keep on bringing back to the decision makers and policymakers there. And so we'll, I think because of the timing, we'll share this recording and all the materials and some of the different links that we had today with the different resources. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to any of us. We'll share Tom's contact information as well. And I think we're just starting this conversation on resiliency, right? And we want to continue it. And if others have additional topics for 2021 that you really want to dive into, we want to hear those too. So we'll be reaching out with questions about that. And but thank you for your time this morning. And we look forward to continuing the conversation. So thank you all.
Thanks all.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.